So good morning, everyone. It is just fabulous to be here today. I want to thank Loretta, the head of EPSCoR, and the entire EPSCoR team for inviting me to present. I tremendously enjoy all of these interactions with the EPSCoR community. I do hope to listen in on Thursday to hear your discussion on the upcoming future of EPSCoR visioning activities. I think we can all agree that we are at a defining moment. Global competition looms large. For the US to be competitive, it will require new moonshots and new strategies for innovation. Signs of climate change are everywhere. Temperatures have risen. We have less snowpack and more melting glaciers. At the same time, the pandemic has laid bare the extent of racial inequities in health services, education, employment, housing, to name a few. While we can see the light at the end of the tunnel in regard to the pandemic, many things will never go back to the way they were, whether it's continued mask wearing or increasing demand for hybrid telework solutions. And how is NSF and the federal government responding to this? Well, with defining moments come opportunities that might not have been possible before. The NSF director, Dr. Sethuraman Panchanathan, Dr. Panch, has articulated a vision for the agency consisting of 4 pillars. That vision aligns well with the National Science Board's Vision 2030 report, as well as with the 4 pillars of the Biden administration. So you can see 2 kinds of connections here that I'm going to talk about. First, the connection between NSF's goals to increase accessibility with the administration's pillar on racial equity and the board's STEM talent goals. And second, the connections between NSF's renewed commitment to innovation and partnership with the administration's economic recovery pillar and the board's focus on the geography of innovation. And of course, that is one area where you, the EPSCoR community, plays an important role. But before we get to that, let's talk about the NSF budget. When you look at the dark green row at the bottom and the actual enacted and appropriations column, you see healthy increases over the years to our current year, fiscal year 21, which has an $8.5 billion appropriation. Okay, next, let's look at EPSCoR's budget over time. We all know that it is legislatively mandated that as the NSF budget rises, so too does the EPSCoR budget. So the first time I saw this figure, which is many years ago now, I have to say I was pleasantly surprised that the largest proportion of funding to EPSCoR jurisdictions does not come from the EPSCoR program itself. That shows significant progress has already been made toward research competitiveness. And as expected, the EPSCoR budget has been rising with the recent increases in the agency's budget. So I want to raise one challenge that I see posted on the EPSCoR Idea Foundation webpage, that while the program comprises 50% of the states, it receives 10% of federal R&D funding. So I'm assuming that this statistic includes all federal EPSCoR programs, but since many of those states are sparsely populated, perhaps the better aspirational statistic is the 20% of the US population in the green at the bottom. Perhaps that could or should be the program's North Star, getting more students into STEM. So I see 2 approaches to making increasing progress with research competitiveness. One is what I briefly mentioned, what the board calls the geography of innovation. What they are talking about is the possibility of expanding the geography of innovation to include science and engineering hubs all across the country, not just in the Boston corridor or in Silicon Valley. And certainly I believe wholeheartedly that the program is poised to begin considering such a challenge. Let's look at where those hubs of innovation might be. So this is from a study conducted by Peter Egger and Nicole Lemo at ETH Zurich. And the legend shows low to high innovation productivity from light yellow to dark reddish brown. The size of the regions is prescribed by an OECD patent registration database, and all this is normalized by region size. So I want you to gaze over the areas with the lightest yellow across the country, moving west to east, from the desert and mountain regions of the west to the center of the country, and then finally to Appalachia and the mountain regions moving into New England. As you scan, I want you to notice that there are plenty of pockets of red to dark brown within those regions. They are not devoid of innovation, high innovation by any means. And if we were to overlay the EPSCoR jurisdictions on this map, plenty of it would be light yellow, but there are also plenty of places where major innovation exists today that could be increased and scaled. The second approach to scaling research competitiveness is to broaden participation in STEM, bringing in more members from underrepresented groups into the pipeline. So Dr. Ponch asked the question, how do we scale? How do we bring in more people? So let's look at NSF data. On the left, we see proposal submission and funding rates for women and underrepresented minorities. They submit a smaller proportion of proposals to NSF than do men and non-underrepresented minorities, but their funding rates are higher than the average. On the right, we see trends over time of women and underrepresented minorities. The black dotted line is the average funding rate. Over the last 10 years, women have done better than the average, but it was only in the 2016-2017 timeframe that underrepresented minority funding rates rose above the average. Okay, let's look at some EPSCoR data. Over the last 10 years, we see EPSCoR PI funding rates slightly below the average. Working to increase research competitiveness will create opportunities to fix that. Let's look at the demographics of track 1 participants. We have gender parity for undergraduates, but not for the other participants. And again, the same thing for underrepresented minorities. Undergraduates comprise the group nearest to their proportions in the population. So we have great opportunities here to scale up participation. The students are there at the undergraduate level. Now we need to retain them across the STEM pipeline. Next, I want to turn to NSF's broadening participation programs. So this is a list of NSF programs, broadening participation ones, that is part of the budget request that goes to Congress each year. This year, the total request was almost $1 billion. So EPSCoR is listed there because of its important goal of increasing geographic diversity in the NSF portfolio. So people have asked, why does NSF have so many broadening participation programs? Isn't there duplication of effort? I argue no, not if you look at the programs as part of an agency-wide strategy. Such a framework helps us to understand why these different programs are necessary and what the goals are for each. The important point is that we need to succeed in all components of such a strategy in order to move the needle in broadening participation. And EPSCoR does already participate in each category. So let's start with research. NSF has to be at the frontiers of knowledge in order to achieve its mission. So we must fund transformative research projects to create new knowledge. EPSCoR needs to do that too for its jurisdictions to succeed. We also need broadening participation education programs. Each research project has an obligation to train the next generation of scientists and engineers while it is conducting transformational research. Students need actual research experiences to understand the practice of science beyond what they can get from textbooks and classrooms. They need to gain access to that tacit knowledge that is shared among practicing scientists in different research communities. EPSCoR projects provide these kinds of research experiences and can grow the next generation of scientists and engineers. Research infrastructure is also essential. We know from studies of breakthrough discoveries that they often happen after new research equipment spreads into wide use in particular research communities. More granular telescopes or microscopes, for example, enable scientists to see phenomena that were unobservable before. Big data techniques allow for new modeling and simulation approaches, never possible before, allowing us to get closer to prediction, like we can today with weather, and as we hope in the future we can with pandemics. EPSCoR is no different. It needs research infrastructure of all kinds, especially for advanced computational data analytics, if its scientists are to be competitive. Next, EPSCoR must continually engage with its stakeholders and research communities to gain feedback on what is working and what is not working. And that is why we hold PI meetings like we're doing here today, and COVs, and develop community visioning activities. Finally, to succeed, we must work with our research communities to inform policy and practice changes when they become necessary. The most recent changes to eligibility are one example of that. So in summary, we need all of these components if we are to move the needle in broadening participation in EPSCoR. Another way to look at the EPSCoR program is to understand the focus of each track in terms of what its goals are. Each track has a theory of change, implicit or explicit. Track 4, for example, is focused on enhancing the research competitiveness of individual PIs, especially early career PIs, and creating new research relationships through effective mentoring. Tracks 1, 2, and 3 are focused on transforming institutions so that they become more competitive in key research areas and can attract top talent. Tracks 1 and 2 are also focused on transforming the science and engineering footprint of entire jurisdictions through partnerships and collaborations. And finally, I would argue that we want to encourage regional transformations, which track 2 begins to address with its focus on interjurisdictional research projects. Proof of that is evident in this EPSCoR research competitive models. ARIC, all of the target areas I just mentioned are nested together. We need to focus on all of them to make progress in research competitiveness. Finally, I want to point out that a theory of change has been developed for EPSCoR. Here it is in all of its gory detail. But there are 5 goals that come out of this. And each one is absolutely critical, whether it's catalyzing research, establishing STEM pipelines, broadening participation, affecting engagement, and impacting jurisdictional economic development. With that, I'm going to end. Thank you so much for listening. I now want to turn this over to Rhonda Davis, who is the head of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion here at NSF, and we'll take questions after Rhonda speaks. Thank you so much. Rhonda, over to you.